Montana Territory, spring of 1879. The wind carried the smell of snowmelt and pine through the Bitterroot Mountains, but inside the weathered trading post at the edge of the wilderness, the air was thick with silence. Georgia Whitlow sat on a wooden crate near the back wall, arms wrapped tight around her middle, eyes fixed on the dirt floor. Her dress was stiff with dust from the trail, and her boots had split at the toes. She had not spoken in hours. The wagon train had rolled out at first light, leaving behind 2 barrels of spoiled flour, a broken axle, and her. Georgia had begged them not to go. She had stood in the cold morning light, voice hoarse from the weeks on the trail, and said, "You promised you would take me to Fort Benton." But the trail boss had barely looked at her. "We took you far enough," he said. "You ain't our burden." And then they were gone, just like that. The old trader, Mr. Ellison, had watched the whole thing from behind the counter, lips pressed thin. He gave her a blanket and a tin of beans, but nothing more. "You can wait inside until someone passes through," he said. "But I ain't taking you anywhere." Now, 2 days later, Georgia had not moved much from her spot. Her stomach was tight with hunger, and her hands were red from scrubbing clothes in the icy creek out back. Every sound that drifted through the post's warped windows made her flinch every hoofbeat, every creak of leather. She had nothing left. No family, no money, no one coming, until the door swung open. A man stepped through, tall and broad-shouldered, dust clinging to his coat, his hat pulled low over sun-darkened eyes. He walked with the kind of quiet confidence that came from years in the saddle. A rifle rested across his back, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Georgia lifted her eyes slowly. "Whitley Langford," the trader greeted him. "Back from the Ruby Range, I see." Whitley nodded once, his gaze scanning the room. "Heard some talk in Helena," he said, voice deep and even. "You had a girl left behind here." Mr. Ellison grunted. "She is still here." Whitley's eyes landed on her. He took her in her drawn face, her trembling hands, the way she did not speak, and then his jaw tightened. "She is the only thing I came for." Georgia blinked. Her breath caught in her throat. Mr. Ellison raised a brow. "You know her?" "Since we were children," Whitley said. "Back in Missouri." That was true. Georgia remembered now, vaguely. A boy with dark hair and a crooked smile who used to sneak her apples off her father's tree. Before the war. Before everything fell apart. She stood, slow and uncertain. You came all this way for me?" Whitley stepped closer, removing his hat. "I heard what they done. Leaving you here like that. I rode 3 days straight." She stared at him. His hands were calloused. His face was rough with trail dust, but his eyes were kind, steady. "I do not have anywhere left to go," she said, her voice cracking. "They took everything." "Not everything," he said. "You still have me, Georgia." That was when the tears came, hot and sudden. She covered her mouth with her hand, and he stepped close enough to catch her if she fell. "Let me take you back," he said softly. "I got a place now, a cabin not far from Deer Lodge. It is quiet, safe. You would not have to worry anymore. I do not want to be a burden." "You would not be," he said. "You never were." She nodded, too choked up to speak. Whitley turned to the trader. "She is leaving with me." Mr. Ellison shrugged. "Suit yourself." Whitley helped her load her small satchel onto his horse. She could barely lift it. He took her hand, warm and solid, and helped her into the saddle. Then he mounted behind her, wrapping one arm around her waist to steady her. They rode out as the sun dipped behind the trees. The air turned colder, but Georgia leaned back against him, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something close to safe. They camped that night beside a stream, the fire crackling low. Whitley gave her the last of his jerky and half his blanket. "You do not talk much," she said, her voice small in the dark. "I never needed to," he replied. "Not with you." She looked over at him, the firelight catching the softer lines of his face. "You remembered me all this time?" He nodded. "You were the only one who ever looked me in the eye after my pa died." They sat in silence after that, but it was not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that held meaning. Georgia lay down wrapped in the blanket and closed her eyes. She felt Whitley shift beside her, keeping watch like a sentinel. And just before she drifted to sleep, she whispered, "Thank you for coming." "I always would have," he whispered back. The trail ahead was long, but for the first time in a long while, Georgia did not feel alone. Whitley had come for her, and he was not letting go. The trail narrowed into pine-shadowed ridges as they rode west. The snow thinned to patches along the north faces of rocks, and the wind carried the first green scent of thawed earth. Whitley kept the horse at a steady pace, mindful of George's grip around his coat. She held on with quiet steadiness, though her body was still stiff from the days she'd spent huddled on that trading post floor. They stopped just past midday near a rise where the trees broke and the sky opened wide. Whitley dismounted first, then reached for her hand without a word. She let him help her down, her legs unsure beneath her. He didn't comment on it. There was a creek below the ridge, shallow but moving fast, fed by the melting snow. Whitley knelt to fill the canteen. Georgia stood back, arms folded, watching the way his shoulders moved beneath his coat, the way he tested the ground with his boot before stepping closer to the edge. "You built the cabin yourself?" she asked, her voice quieter than she'd meant it to be. He looked back at her, squinting into the sun. "Mostly. Some of the beams came from an old sawmill up near Phillipsburg. Took me most of last winter. Roof leaks a little when it rains too hard, but it holds." She nodded, brushing her hair back from her face where the wind had pulled it loose. "You live alone out there? For now." He stood and worked the canteen cap closed. "Got a milk cow and 2 hens, if that counts for company." Georgia gave a short breath through her nose. Not quite a laugh, but something near it. He offered her the canteen and she drank. The water was cold enough to bite behind her teeth, but she didn't stop. When she lowered it, he was still watching her. "I can help with the hens," she said. He didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth eased some. "They'll be glad of it. They don't take to me." The horse grazed nearby, bridle looped over a branch. A pair of magpies darted through the clearing, and the quiet stretched between them again, not awkward, but waiting. She walked a few steps toward the edge of the rise, boots crunching soft pine needles. "I don't remember what it feels like to stay anywhere," she said. "Not really." Whitley didn't move, but his voice came steady behind her. "You'll remember." She turned to him. "You're sure you want me there? It's not just pity." "I don't carry pity, Georgia. Never have. If I didn't want you there, I wouldn't have come." Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to nod once and turned back to the trees. They rode until sunset pushed amber light through the branches. Whitley's cabin came into view just as the last of the warmth left the air. It stood on a rise above a narrow field, with a split rail fence along the slope and smoke curling from the chimney. The front porch sagged a little on one side, and the windows were crooked in their frames, but it was solid. Georgia stared at it as they approached, her fingers tightening where they gripped the saddle horn. Whitley dismounted and helped her down again, then led the horse to the lean to behind the main house. She stood in front of the cabin, unsure if she should step forward without permission. He returned with a lantern, lit low. "It's warmer inside," he said, and opened the door. The cabin smelled of pine sap and iron stove, with a faint hint of tobacco. A rocking chair stood near the hearth, and a wool blanket had been folded over its back. There were shelves of tools near the door, and a small table set for one. She stepped in slowly, running her palm along the edge of the doorframe. "I'll take the cot in the corner," he said, hanging the lantern on a hook near the mantel. "You can have the bed. I can take the cot." He shook his head, unrolling his coat sleeves. "You've been sleeping on dirt. Take the bed." She looked over at the small straw mattress tucked into the corner, worn but clean. "Thank you." He pulled a tin plate from the shelf and dropped dried beans into a pot of water on the stove. She watched the way he moved around the space, not rushed, not uncertain. It was clear he had lived alone a long while, but nothing about it felt closed off. She set her satchel near the door and stepped to the window, where the last light lingered behind the trees. Whitley stirred the beans and finally said, "You still play piano?" She turned, surprised. "Not since before my father passed. I remember you used to hum the notes when you thought nobody could hear. I didn't think you were listening." "I was always listening," he said. She sat at the edge of the bed, resting her hands in her lap. The stove crackled, and the scent of cooking filled the room. They ate side by side at the table, sharing the quiet between them without needing to fill it. Georgia watched the steam rise from her plate and felt the floor beneath her feet, solid and still. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was waiting for someone to turn her away. After the dishes were cleaned, Whitley stepped out to check the horse and bank the embers in the lean-to. Georgia stood alone for a moment in the doorway of the cabin, the cool air brushing her cheeks. When he returned, he looked at her but didn't speak. She stepped back to let him pass, then paused. "You knew I wouldn't have anywhere else to go," she said. "I knew you deserved a place anyway." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once and stepped inside. He closed the door gently behind them. By the seventh day, the rhythm between them had begun to settle into something quiet and steady. Georgia rose early, tying her hair back with a strip of calico and slipping out the door before Whitley stirred from the cot. She fed the hens, scraped ash from the stove, and fetched water from the creek in a dented tin pail. Her hands had toughened, the raw spots along her palms healing into calluses, though the skin still reddened in the cold. One morning, she returned to find Whitley crouched by the hearth, mending the handle of a kettle with a length of wire. He nodded to her without pause, then twisted the wire tighter with a pair of pliers. "I didn't know you could fix things like that," she said, setting the pail beside the door. "I didn't know I could either," he said, easing the kettle upright. "You learn when it breaks and no one else is around to do it." Georgia knelt beside him, watching as he tested the handle's strength. "Does it ever feel strange, being so far from town?" He shrugged, resting the kettle on the stove. "I don't miss the noise. I used to think the quiet meant I'd been forgotten," she said. "Now I think it just means I've got room to breathe." He looked at her, then not startled, just considering, and she felt something settle low in her chest. That afternoon, she followed him to the edge of the field where the fence needed mending. He handed her a pair of leather gloves and a coil of baling twine. The wind carried the scent of thawed grass and old pine needles. She worked beside him in silence, watching how he drove each nail with care, never wasting a movement. After a while, she asked, "Do you ever go back east?" "No," he said, without looking up. "There's nothing there for me. I used to think if I went back, I'd find something I lost, but I wouldn't know where to start looking." Whitley stood and leaned against the post. "Some things don't need finding. They find you when they're ready." She stayed quiet after that, tying off the twine and brushing her hands on her skirt. The sky turned pale with evening, and a hawk circled above the far ridge. That night, she sat on the porch steps with a wool shawl around her shoulders, while Whitley cleaned his saddle gear. The air had turned crisp again, the stars just beginning to show. I never asked what you did after Missouri, she said. He worked a cloth over the stirrup leather, slow and methodical. I joined up with a cattle drive out of Abilene. Stayed on the move a long time. Guess I figured if I kept going, nothing could catch up with me. Did it? She asked. He paused, then looked up. Not until I saw you at that post. Georgia tucked the shawl tighter. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come. You'd have found a way, he said. You always did. A long silence passed between them, the kind that didn't need breaking. She could hear the hens settling in their roost and the faint creak of the porch boards beneath them. I used to think love looked like something grand, she said quietly. Like a man sweeping you off your feet. All sweet words and promises. Whitley set the cloth aside. It ain't always loud. Sometimes it's just showing up. And staying. She turned her head and found him already watching her. The light from the window behind them cast his face in soft shadow, and something in her chest ached not in pain, but with the weight of everything unspoken finally understood. I don't want to be afraid of staying, she said. You don't have to be. He didn't touch her, but she felt the nearness of him like warmth off the stove. She didn't move away. Inside, the fire crackled low. The porch lantern swung gently in the breeze, casting long lines across the ground. Georgia looked toward the fields stretching dark into the trees. Then she looked at him. Will you walk with me tomorrow? Toward the ridge. I will. She nodded, and her voice came softer. I'd like to see where this land ends. Whitley didn't look away. It don't end. It just keeps going. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was chasing something already lost. She felt like she'd come to the place where something good could begin. The ridge walk began just after sunrise, when the light turned the frost on the grass to glinting threads of silver. Georgia tied on her shawl and stepped outside without needing to speak. Whitley was already saddling the horse, though he didn't mount it, just led it behind them as they took the narrow trail that wound past the edge of the field and into the hills. They didn't talk much at first. The earth was soft underfoot, patches of moss edging the rocks. A hawthorn bush bloomed ahead, its pale blossoms trembling in the breeze. Georgia reached out and touched one, then drew her hand back, fingertips damp with dew. I used to think Montana would feel like the end of the world, she said. Turns out it's more like a beginning. Whitley adjusted the reins in his hand. That's how it felt to me the first time I came through. Like the land was waitin' for someone to mean something to it. They crested a rise where the trees thinned and gave way to a spread of open country rolling hills. A small gully below where elk tracks crossed the mud, and beyond that, the blue shadow of distant peaks. Georgia stopped, the wind tugging at her skirt. My father never let me go more than a half-day's ride from home, she said. Said it wasn't proper. Said the world would eat a girl whole if she wandered too far. He wasn't wrong, Whitley said. But he never said what'd happen if the girl bit back. She turned toward him, eyes narrowed against the sun. I don't know who I'm supposed to be now. I don't have the name I was born with, not really. Don't have the life I thought I'd have. You don't need to be anything but who you are, he said. That's always been enough. He didn't offer more. Just stood with her while the wind moved through the grass like a tide pulling west. They stayed up there until midday. Georgia knelt beside a patch of wild onions and dug some up with a small stick. Whitley tied his coat around the saddle horn and wandered off a short way, returning with 2 dry branches of chokecherry for the stove. On the way back, Georgia asked, Did you ever think about marrying? I did once, he said. Thought maybe if I made enough I could ask the girl proper. But she left town before I ever got the chance. Married a banker in St. Louis. Georgia didn't answer at first. Then, did you love her? I thought I did, he said. But I didn't stay up nights thinking about her after. Have you stayed up thinking about me? He looked over, eyes steady. Every night since I left Missouri. She didn't speak again until they reached the cabin, and even then, it wasn't with words. She took the wild onions to the stove, set them in a pan, and added a pinch of salt from the earthen jar. Whitley lit the fire, then stepped out to split the last of the kindling. When he came in, Georgia was setting the table. 2 plates, tin cups filled with water. The onions sizzled low, their scent sharp and sweet. "Tomorrow I'd like to try stitching those curtains straight," she said, gesturing to the fabric hanging unevenly by the back window. "They look like they've been running from something." He pulled his chair out. "I'd be glad for the company while you do it." They ate without hurry, and when the last bite was gone, Georgia stood and reached for the wash basin. Whitley caught her wrist lightly. "I can do that. I want to." She turned back to the basin, and he watched her, something unspoken settling between them again, not silence this time, but something fuller than that, something that had been waiting for both of them to be ready. Later, when the sun dipped and the shadows leaned long across the floor, Georgia stood by the window, one hand resting on the sill. "I don't know what happens next," she said. "You don't have to," Whitley said. "Just stay tonight. Stay tomorrow. After that, we'll see." She turned, and something in her gaze was steadier than it had been before. "I think I'd like to," she said. He nodded once, slow. "Then you're home." The first real rain came 2 weeks later, steady and cold, beating down on the roof in a rhythm that made Georgia pause while sewing a patch onto one of Whitley's shirts. She'd set up a small work table near the hearth, close enough to the fire that she could feel its warmth on her knees. Outside, the land blurred into a wash of wet greens and browns, the hills softened by mist. Whitley came in from the shed with his coat soaked through and his hat dripping. He set it on the peg by the door and ran a hand through his damp hair before kneeling to tug off his boots. "Creek's risen past the lower fence," he said, voice low against the sound of the rain. "But the henhouse is dry. I checked twice." She nodded, folding the shirt neatly and setting it aside. "I boiled a little barley earlier. There's some salt pork left from last week." He rubbed his shoulder, then looked over. "You're starting to sound like you've lived here forever." "I don't think time has much to do with it," she said. "Some places just feel like they've been waiting on you." He didn't answer right away. Then, "That's how I felt when I saw you standing in that trading post." Georgia stood and crossed to the stove, lifting the pot lid with a cloth. The scent of simmering broth filled the room, earthy and sharp. She ladled 2 bowls and set them on the table without ceremony. They ate with soft clinks of spoon against tin, the rain a steady hush on the cabin roof. Afterward, Whitley sat back, arms resting on the edge of the table. "Do you miss anything from before?" She thought for a moment. "I miss music, not the kind in saloons. The soft kind, the kind people played just because it felt good in their hands." She glanced at the far wall, where a shelf of tools hung. "I haven't touched a piano in years. I've got a neighbor down toward Deer Lodge who plays fiddle," he said. "She's older than sin and meaner than a wet cat, but she plays clean. If she's still alive come summer, maybe we'll go hear her." Georgia smiled faintly. "I'd like that." He stood and pushed his chair back. "Come out to the porch. It's raining." He opened the door and looked back at her, water already darkening the boards beneath his feet. "That's the point." Curious, she followed, wrapping her shawl tighter. The air outside was cool and wet, the smell of pine bark and damp earth stronger than anything. He stepped out into the rain and turned, arms slightly outstretched. "You ever stand in it?" he asked. "No," she said, hesitant at the edge. "I always ran from it." "Don't," he said. "Not this time." She stepped barefoot into the mud. Her hem soaked instantly, Rain slid over her hair, down her cheeks. Whitley stood still, watching her. "It's cold," she said, laughing once, surprised by her own voice. "But it feels honest." He moved closer, not touching her. "You're not the same girl I knew back then." She looked up at him, lashes wet, breath misting between them. "I'm not, but I think I'm better now." He reached for her hand, the rain running down both their arms, and threaded his fingers through hers. "You are," he said. "And you're here. Finally." She stepped into him, and he caught her around the waist, not tight, just enough. She rested her forehead against his jaw. "I want to stay," she whispered. "Not just for a season. I want to be here, with you." He didn't speak, only pulled her in closer, the rain falling around them like the world was washing itself clean. Later, they dried by the fire, her hair in loose braids. His shirt hung near the hearth to warm. Georgia stood beside the bed, watching the way the lamplight hit the curve of his shoulder. "Whitley," she said softly, "would it be enough for you? A life like this?" He met her eyes. "It already is." She drew in a breath, then stepped forward, reaching for his hand. "Then let's make it ours." They married by the creek 2 days after the thaw broke, with the neighbor from Deer Lodge standing silent witness and the wind tugging gently at George's skirts. There was no preacher, only the land, and their hands joined, her voice steady when she said, "This is my home now." Whitley's answer was a simple yes, and it was enough. They planted a garden that spring, rows of potatoes and beans. Georgia coaxed flowers from the edge of the porch, small and bright. Whitley built a second chair and set it beside hers. They sat together in the evenings, sometimes speaking, sometimes not, always close. When the neighbor brought her fiddle by midsummer, Georgia listened with her head against Whitley's shoulder, the sound curling through the trees like smoke. She didn't cry. She didn't need to anymore. By winter, they'd added a second room to the cabin. Georgia filled it with quilts, hand-stitched from scraps of the past. She played a small reed organ Whitley traded for in Deer Lodge, her fingers slow but sure. He built shelves for her books and carved her name into the doorframe, just beneath his own. They lived through hard seasons and easy ones. They fought sometimes, but never cruelly. They raised chickens, and later, when the time came, a son who had Whitley's quiet eyes and George's stubborn mouth. She never left again, because she didn't need to, and he never asked her to be anything but who she already was. They grew old beneath the same roof, hands still finding each other in the dark. And when folks asked how they managed so long alone out there, Georgia always said the same thing. "We weren't alone. We had each other. And that was enough." Always.